So, welcome, Elliot. Um, so,
I
so Elliot has been a guest on the Substack before as I think you were a wine and fries guest.
I was a wine and fries guest.
Yes, and we chatted about all kinds of stuff, but now we're here to talk about his book, which I'm very excited about. I don't know. Um,
When I hang it upside down, it's a sign of distress or I guess surrender or retreat. So maybe that's not what I intended to do here, but yeah.
Okay, I want to talk about your book and I want to talk about a lot of stuff. I do need to
Okay.
start out with a confession.
Oh no, you didn't read it. You didn't do the homework.
I totally read the whole book.
All right,
I had never
here we go.
heard of Bernie Goetz. Is that how you say his
Uh-huh.
name?
Yeah, I get that. I get that. Because you're from
So, and I
Virginia,
mean, I
right?
grew up in Virginia. You and I are the same age. Is that right?
Uh,
Am I
in
older than
truth,
you?
you are 2 years older. Yes.
Okay,
However,
so
but
I'm a little older than you.
right.
Um, I grew up in Virginia, but I felt kind of bad reading this because I felt like I should have heard about this, but I didn't.
So here's my because I did
And
some
by the way, is
informal.
there, before you answer, does everybody on this call, I mean, I guess I'm not gonna be able to take a poll, but like, have most of you heard of this?
Or who had
Okay.
not?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's
They
fine.
all have. Okay, so I'm pretty much the only one, but go ahead, finish what you were saying.
So it's some informal focus grouping I did when I wrote the book. When I started was that pretty much anybody born before 1978, most people had a sense of the, or many people had a sense of the book, right? People from in and around New York sort of instinctively have some knowledge of the book. And then finally, I would say like a third of law students cover it in criminal law for obvious reasons because it comes up a bit. But not everybody did. I mean, I think there's if you remember the song "We Didn't Start the Fire" by Billy Joel, the
Yeah, yeah,
reference
yeah.
to foreign debts, homeless vets, AIDS crack Bernie Goetz, and for many people that it was one of those lines that people had heard but didn't know what it meant or what it referred to. Well, yeah, I mean, it should tell you something that in the pantheon of 20th century events that includes Bridge on the River Kwai, Reagan, Ayatollahs in Iran, and Doris Day, somehow this figure rose to inclusion in that song. And not that Billy Joel is the great chronicler of modern events, but but it's telling and it's significant. So yeah, not everybody knew about it, but it is a sort of noteworthy moment in modern American history.
So, you and I had talked for a while when we were talking about writing books and stuff, and you
Yeah.
had been going around on a number of different topics before you alighted on this. And you talk a little
Mm-hmm.
bit in the introduction about why this case, but like what led you to this and what were you hoping to unpack that you didn't already know when you began writing
Uh-huh.
this book?
So a couple things. I would say one, I um, didn't, certainly the facts of the case. I thought it was going to be an interesting story, just generally, right? It's just sort of, yay, interesting legally, interesting factually, whatever else. And I thought just retelling the story would have been kind of interesting. Turns out that that the whole, I started seeing more and more the number of ties that bring the story to today, both in terms of the bigger metaphorical ones along the lines of how America thinks of vigilantes, what America thinks of race and crime in the criminal justice system or self-defense or whatever else. They all seem to come up repeatedly in the book. There are the literal tie-ins where many of the people at the center of this story all end up on running for president of the United States at some point. You have multiple, literally, Rudy Giuliani and Al Sharpton end up credible candidates for president of the United States. Curtis Sliwa runs for mayor. Bernard Goetz runs for mayor of New York. The National Rifle Association saw him, the Goetz story, play a big role in its rise. And so, both in terms of conceptual ties to today, but also quite literally um, people who traverse the decades. It just it's a very relevant story today, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah. And you open with the incident, I forget what year it was, but it was David Penny, is that right?
Daniel Penny.
Daniel Penny. And this is
Mhm.
um like when that happened, were you like, oh, here we are again?
Interesting. I mean, I hadn't started writing the books, so that incident happened in 2023. Now it became obvious that the tie-ins were
Can you
pretty
repeat what the
clear.
incident was the day in
Oh
case
yeah, yeah.
Daniel Penny?
So Daniel Penny, Jordan Neely is a mentally ill Michael Jackson impersonator having an incident on the New York City subway. Daniel Penny, he sorry, that was an alarm. That was an alarm to remind me in case I was still on the studio, up in the studio, to remember, come down quick. I got to do Asha's thing. That's what you just heard right there. Um, the um, he starts having sort of a psychiatric episode or incident, and uh, Jordan and Daniel Penny came up behind him, just put him in a chokehold, and ultimately ended up killing him. Well, the it ends up being a remarkably similar story in that number one, it is violence or danger or acrimony or whatever else on the New York City subway. Number two, there's a racial element to it because you have a black victim and a white defender, perpetrator, whatever noun you wish to use. And most importantly, there's it's sort of a vigilantism or self-defense angle to it. Now, I would note when Daniel Penny went to trial, the case that ultimately the that governed his trial literally is state versus Getz. The New York state self-defense law was ultimately set in the Getz case and helped shape how New York or the New York courts think about what self-defense is and when it's appropriate. And so, yeah, it absolutely is literally the same case. Um, and moreover, the other thing I would add about the Daniel Penny Jordan Neely case is that um, the celebrity that came from engaging in that act, both of them really did, in some ways, capitalize on getting more popular on account of having been at the center of a violent act.
Oh, is Daniel Penny now like some sort of
Well,
celebrity?
so well, within days of his getting acquitted, so he went on trial, was acquitted of second degree murder, acquitted of assault, acquitted of everything else. Within days, he actually ended up in Donald Trump's box at the Army Navy game, the football game in Philadelphia. And then about 2 weeks after that, he ended up with a job offer from Andreessen Horowitz, the biggest venture capital firm in America, if not the world. So he seemed to land on his feet just fine and probably may not would not have gotten those opportunities had it not been for the celebrity that came from engaging in a somewhat vigilantist, for lack of a better term, act of violence on the New York City subway.
Yeah. So let's talk about this incident. And you actually talked to Bernie Goetz.
I did.
That sounds like a wild conversation.
It really is. And we had emailed back and forth, and I will note that he still emails me. I haven't gotten one in a few days, but I get a lot of Bernard Goetz's thoughts now, particularly when I was out doing a lot of interviews for the book. He would watch them and then write, and he still thinks. So we had emailed back and forth a bunch, and I had said that I wanted to speak with him about the book. And when they just picked up the phone and called him, and the next thing I know, I'm on the phone with Bernie Goetz, and we're just talking. And it was a truly bonkers, meandering 45 minutes, to some extent that I will never get back. Um, uh, and lack of a better way to put it, I think the thing that stunned me the most about, or just struck me the most about it, was how unrepentant he was about the shooting. I would have thought that someone who had been at the center of such an act over the decades would have gotten at least some level of self-awareness or self-reflection or analysis about it. That, look, I was scared, I felt threatened, I uh those guys threatened me, so I had to do what had to be done to protect myself. However, it was a tragedy, and whatever happened to those four young boys is really tragic. Well, no, when I talked to him, he really, I mean, he said to me that those guys needed shooting, and ultimately seemed to believe that he was the one who had the fortune, whether good fortune or bad fortune, to mete out the justice that these people had coming to them. He just sort of felt like almost not emboldened or empowered, but just that he had committed an act of public service. He really seemed to feel that.
Yeah, that part of it, the unrepentantness, to me was really striking because, the research that I'm doing is a lot about how people justify their own actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was actually like, I might use this example in my book because it to have the repentance, you have to have a certain amount of empathy or at least an understand. Like, in other words, you have to be able to feel guilt, like tolerate some feelings of guilt or shame, because then even if you're just going to justify it retroactively. And this kind of
Yeah,
gets to the heart of how he saw and what you're kind of talking about in terms of the race relations here is not just him, but all of society who saw these four victims as in many ways deserving of what
absolutely.
happened. So if can you unpack like kind of the how this unfolded so for people who
Mm-hmm.
might need their
Yeah,
memories
exactly.
jogged? Yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And it's funny, not everybody has their cameras on. I saw some hands up, but I don't know if everybody remembers literally the specifics of the story. So let me just tell you exactly what happened. So September 22nd, 1984, Bernard Goetz was on New York City subway car. There were four teenagers, 18 and 19-year-olds from the Bronx on the car at the time. They were acting up. There's no question that they were rowdy. They were pounding on the seats. They were asking people for cigarettes. They were doing pull-ups on the bars, but didn't threaten or mug or harm anybody. Getz got on. One of them approached Getz and either demanded or asked for $5. Either, sir, give me $5, or hey, sir, can I have $5? Getz, who always carried an unlicensed firearm on him, at that moment felt he was about to be mugged. He said he knew a mugging was coming. It was just imminent. So he just pulled out his gun and shot them all in rapid succession: one, two, three, four, five. He's believed to have stood over the final guy, Daryl Caby, and shot him once, said, "You don't look so bad, here's another," and shot him again, ultimately paralyzing him from the mid chest down. And then ultimately, this happened a few weeks later, but he ends up in a coma and brain damage and comes out with the mental capacity of a 9-year-old. So ultimately, that's the aftermath. Now, Getz did end up getting heralded as somewhat of an avenger or a hero by many people in and around New York City. A big part of that stemmed from the fact that New York City was just rough at the time in a way that people may not appreciate today. It was just, to use a statistical basis, today, New York City's homicide rate is anywhere from maybe 250 to maybe 400 homicides a year. In 1984, there were 1,700 homicides a year. It's just literally violence and unrest and disorder and civic mismanagement on a mythic scale that's just not like the New York that we're aware of today. And that seemed to, drive the way in which people embraced Getz.
And Getz himself had been a victim of
He had
a
mugging.
mugging
He'd been
himself,
mugged
right?
about 2.5 years before the actual shooting. He'd been mugged. He had been uh, the three young black men had sort of approached him and accosted him as he was getting off the subway, holding a bunch of electrical equipment. He's an an electrical engineer, and injured him. He injured his meniscus in his knee, banged up his face, tore a pectoral muscle, and after that, he sort of committed to never being mugged again, and always carried his firearm with him.
So let's talk about the law then, because you go into that a lot.
Yeah,
And not surprisingly, because that's kind of the angle that you're
that's what
looking
I
at.
do.
So how does that play in to
Yeah.
his trial, right? Because you go into this very interesting explanation of the reasonableness standard. And in
Hmm.
some ways, I think it's kind of pertinent to what we see now. I mean, Getz was a ordinary civilian, but we are like we look
Hmm.
at the
Hmm.
reasonableness standard when we look at law enforcement. shoots
Hmm.
too, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
I was actually
Absolutely.
surprised when I was reading because I always understood the reasonableness standard to be the hypothetical, objectively reasonable person. So
Hmm.
is this a quirk of New York law that was happening? So
No,
anyway, so
no.
explain it from the beginning
Yeah,
so that
yeah,
people
yeah.
know.
And it's funny, this came up for me because I, like you, Asha, I thought about this a little bit. I always thought it was just a hypothetical. Um, in the context of ICE, I looked this up in Minnesota. Pardon me, I looked this up for federal agents, what the standard is there, and it might surprise you too. But so, real quick, so the law in New York was not defined. It merely said that one can use deadly force in self-defense if he reasonably believes that a mugging, right, robbery is the term, is imminent, right? Now, the law had never defined what quote unquote reasonable means. And so it ultimately ended up going to the highest court in New York to sort out what that definition was. They ultimately landed on, and there's two different ways to read the word quote unquote reasonable. One is a purely subjective reading of the term, um, uh, a purely subjective reading of the term, namely, uh, someone's action is reasonable if his fear was sincere. Like, did we believe him when he says he was afraid? Then he's reasonably afraid. Okay. There's also an objective standard of reasonableness, which is, did he behave in a manner such that we would expect ordinary people to behave in the same circumstances? Did he comport in a manner that tracked with the rest of society? Objective reasonableness. So, did the word mean the subjective, much more defendant friendly standard, or objective, the much more prosecution friendly standard? Well, ultimately, it goes up to the highest court in New York that lands on a hybrid definition, which says that first you assess the sincerity of his fear, the subjective fear, and then graft on top of that the objective fear. So, does the jury believe that he was afraid? Yes. And if so, did he then act in a manner that comported with how society would or how an ordinary person would act under the same circumstances? This came up when I mentioned ICE in Minnesota. Um, it came up in that ICE's, or the Department of Homeland Security's internal standard, follows an objective standard, which is, um, did the officer act in a manner that comports with how we would expect other officers to act in the same circumstances? It doesn't matter what he really felt. What really matters is, how did we think the body of officers should act? And that's how, when ICE sort of sanctions somebody or censures somebody for acting outside the bounds of their job, that's the standard that they would follow.
Do they do that?
Does ICE do well?
Anyway,
Hard to tell. I mean,
hard to tell. Yeah.
um, it's hard to tell, and I think we are not done seeing the litigation that will come out of Minnesota.
And just to drive home the point, the put a finer point on it, Elliot, what you're saying is because a subjective standard will then essentially, I mean, I would say legitimize implicit bias
Yeah,
and
yeah,
racial
oh yeah.
bias, right? Because if you're really only looking at subjective fear and also maybe
Mhm.
even like delusional and crazy
All of it.
thinking, right?
Or
You
I
know what I
mean,
mean?
I would
Like
even
if I think like, a 5-year-old kid is gonna,
if
infect me
you
with a
well,
disease, like
this
I would
was
go shoot them. You know what I'm saying?
this was Gregory Waples, the prosecutor. I interviewed Waples, and we talked about the whole case and his feelings about it and everything. But one of the things he said in the argument was, you know, the subjective standard would empower someone to use deadly force every time he thinks a black teenager looks at him funny, because if he's afraid and was very scared, or felt scared, then he's allowed to use deadly force, right? And so, yes, it is a very loose standard. So, you know,
Can you place the Central Park Five like in the chrono like where when does
it's
this happen
so
relative? Because you
it's
mentioned that
important.
event.
Yeah, 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 and it's important that you mentioned that, and this is a sort of broader why I wrote the book and why this was a sort of powerful story for me to think about is, New York, for folks who may or may not remember, in the pretty much starting in 1978 or so through 1990, every year or so had one, at least